We are now going to invite our panelists to join me on stage. We have an opening panel called Innovation in Canada, dealing with supply chain disruptions and the effects on national security and economic development. So building on the themes that Phil spoke about just now. So in addition to Phil, I'd like to welcome to the stage Shoute, the CEO of Zinite, and Niraj Mathur, the co-founder of Blumind. So please join me on stage. Oh yes, Phil is all mic'd up. Wonderful. Well, welcome to the stage. Very excited to have you all here. So we got to meet Phil, but we haven't met Jem and Niraj. So I'd ask you to just take 1 to 2 minutes and tell us a little bit about your background. Jem, we know that you were in one of the Venture Lab programs. Maybe tell us a little bit more about Zinite and your background in the space.
Okay. Sorry. So I'm Jem Shoute. I co-founded and am CEO of Zinite. A little bit of background of myself. I have a PhD in solid-state electronics, which I received at the University of Alberta. And I also did my postdoctoral fellowship at Berkeley and U.S. Department of Energy. And after that fellowship, I decided to come to Canada to do a semiconductor startup. The culmination of that resulted in Zinite. And what Zinite is doing is we're going to build the first true 3D chip. And this is enabled by our semiconductor technology, which is a high-performance, power-efficient transistor that is built along the third dimension. To give you kind of a mental model of it, think of it as silicon transistors for the z-axis. Oh, and my perspective will not be on the chip side. It will be more downstream in the supply chain, so anywhere from materials all the way to processes. And I think this is a really important ecosystem that Canada actually invests heavily on in early stages. And I want to make the case that to make investments now in later on in the commercialization. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jem. And Jem flew in from Edmonton to be here today, so we appreciate you making the trip and being here in person. Niraj, tell us a little bit about yourself and Blumind.
Sure. Thanks, Erin. First off, great to see so many people in person after a couple of years. It's a little bit unnerving, actually, because they're not used to this anymore. But great to meet everybody in person. There's a lot of folks that I saw only on Zoom calls the last couple of years, and seeing them face to face has been phenomenal. So hello, everyone. My name is Niraj Mathur. I'm a co-founder at Blumind. A little bit about myself. I've got over a couple of decades in the semiconductor industry based here in Canada. I started my career, like some of the folks here, at good old Nortel Networks back in the day when we were really a leader in this space. I've since then done a couple of startups, successful exits on those, worked at larger Silicon Valley companies as well. Moved over from the world of engineering to more marketing and business leadership, the dark side of our industry, if you will. And then a couple of years ago, got into my head to do a startup again and really drive one from the ground up. And that's what gave birth to Blumind a couple of years ago. We're very fortunate to be part of the HCI program Melissa mentioned earlier. We're in the first cohort of that program. And building the company from the ground up with some really interesting technology and inventions made right here in Ontario and the GTA and Ottawa. We're at a stage where we've got our first chip in the lab just down the hall, and that's super exciting for us. So we're making a lot of progress there. We're in the space of ultra low power artificial intelligence, machine learning, if you will, and we're really laying a new path for this domain. So it's really exciting to be part of this ecosystem and a member of the team here. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that intro. Yes, I find the most unnerving thing about meeting people in person is they're always taller or shorter than you thought, right? So that's what we're all discovering today, everyone's height. Phil, we already heard from you, but are there any fun facts about yourself you want to share? Anything about your background we didn't cover in the bio that everyone in the crowd needs to know?
I was not prepared for that question. I thought you were going to ask me something entirely different. Fun facts. I can't think of one fun thing about me. I'm really a very boring man. I do love dogs. Okay, so my retirement plan, which is still hopefully kind of 7 or 8 years away, is to move into dog cognition and dog psychology, which I'm currently studying. So if any of you have dogs and you want to network and chat about them over lunch or later on, I'll do that with you.
Okay, so we have a future Cesar Milan who is going to be helping train our dogs, a different type of hardware, dog collars. Wonderful. Well, thanks for those introductions. And we're really here to talk about the supply chain disruptions that have happened over the past several years. So I wanted to start with Jem. Jem, you're really coming at this from the perspective of a startup founder bringing your product to market. So how have you seen supply chain challenges affect your ability to scale?
Okay, so as I mentioned before, we're not a chip company today. We're a process technology company, which means that we deal with on materials, we deal with process, we deal with making sure there's the right tooling so that, you know, the end, in this case, the end point being high volume manufacturers, HVM fabs, can actually manufacture our technology at volume. As a startup, there's actually three ways that the supply chain is disrupting startups like Zinite, including Zinite itself. One of them is on the literally on the material side. We are struggling. I should say there are delays in, for example, getting raw materials. Basically, that can convert, you know, precursors, we call it, that converts raw materials into a useful semiconductor. Then we have delays in getting test equipment, so we eventually have to test our transistors. And then also the equipment to fabricate our technology. So that's the, I think that is very similar to some of the struggles that end consumers like automotives have in getting chips for their products. The second one that I think is, I think hits closer to home, that I think that keeps me up at night, is the bottlenecks that we face in continuing our in allowing us to proceed in developing our technology. So it is a new fundamental technology, which means that we have to have a lot of alignment in the supply chain and also the innovation pipeline. And the two biggest gatekeepers, one are the tool vendors, who are the biggest gatekeepers for new process technology entering the market. The second one is many R&D fabs, whether they're standalones, like you see many in Europe and in New York, or even R&D fabs in Intel, like PTD, are let's just say there's more barriers to enter and allow us to develop our processes in there. Now, Zinite is very lucky in that we have enough players that see the value proposition of Zinite's technology, but this is not necessarily true for other semiconductor companies that operate in the same value chain. And so this is where I actually think that Canada can have a lot of impact in. Tool vendors, tooling, equipment tool vendors is not maybe it needs a much more knowledge base, which I think Canada has to build over time. But an R&D type of really an R&D approach that is beyond just the academic and research institution, I think, where it can really help, you know, build kind of Phil's vision of putting Canada not only on the map, but being a critical node in the global semiconductor supply chain. So that's kind of my perspective. Yeah.
Thank you, Jem. Appreciate you sharing. And Niraj, I know you're coming at this from a bit of a different perspective in that you are manufacturing chips. You built your first chip this year and you have a lab here at Venture Lab. You've expressed concern about the ability to scale to high volume production. Can you share more about your concerns and build on Jem's experiences in her challenges on supply chain disruptions and how they've affected Blumind as well?
Yeah, sure. First thing I just want to highlight, it's important for everybody here to understand. A lot of you do, but this is a good thing to state up front, is that the semiconductor industry is not a monolith. Okay, that there's a lot of different types of products, a big variety of products, a big variety of technologies, a big variety of processes that operate in this industry altogether. Okay, and the supply chain issues that we've had don't affect all of these in the same way. It's a very complicated tapestry of things that happen in this industry. So that's one point. The second point to make is this industry is also very cyclical. Okay, so we've seen this over the last 40 years. Every 2 to 3 years, there's a downturn. If you look at the chart of the industry over the last 30 years, you'll see kind of this roller coaster curve, which is very characteristic of our industry, and that's just how things are. The reason for this is two things, inventory issues. There's always this tendency to overcorrect when people see changes happening, and the world economy that has a direct impact on the demand for these goods. So, and there's a lag in the correction for adopting to new demand dynamics. So these are things to understand. It's very complicated to adjust to supply chain issues. And one of the questions I had in my mind is, okay, we went through COVID, which obviously was an anomaly, and as Phil laid out, created this burst of demand and changes in people's behaviors that have directly impacted our industry. But how different is this from the anomaly, like the regular cyclical cycle we've had for eons, right? I don't think we have a solid answer to that, but it'll be really interesting to see how that plays out in the coming years. Coming to Blumind, we're looking at this very differently from Jem and Phil's companies. We're a fabless semiconductor company, so we're a chip designer. We don't manufacture any of our chips. This is a very common model in the industry. We outsource our manufacturing to one of the big fabrication companies in the world, and they build the chips for us. We're still a relatively early stage startup, so we're not in volume production yet. However, we are developing prototype chips. So for us, it was really important to get in the fab, get our prototypes developed. And that was sort of a challenge. It was important to build the right relationships, get the slots in the fab to build our prototypes. Our hope and anticipation is by the time we get to volume production in the coming year plus, we will have enough volume in the fabs for our products. So this is our hope. Just again, the cyclical nature of the industry is by the time we get to volume, we should be in decent shape. But a lot of other companies definitely are struggling with this now.
Yeah. Thanks, Niraj. And you also mentioned something that I think was top of mind in our discussion prior to today's panel, which is, can you really blame COVID? Everyone likes to point to COVID as the main catalyst for these supply chain issues. But Phil, bringing it over to you, can we blame COVID? How much of a part does that play?
I think Niraj said the point. We don't actually really know. So I'm not going to profess some great opinion and that we've got the answers here, because I think we don't. COVID was clearly a black swan event. But I think what we're also seeing, particularly in the geopolitical climate, is a series of black swan events. And so we talk about the industry being cyclical, which it has been forever, now for the last 50 years. But the predictability of that cyclical nature is now not easy to see. So you can't just plot it on a graph and say that's where we're going to be in 10 years, because we are seeing a world which is changing, extremely fast. And events like COVID or say events like the tragic war in Eastern Europe will have a continued effect on our supply chain. And I don't think anybody knows where that's going to end now. It's potentially quite scary. But what I would say is that there is an ever more demand for pervasive compute from edge to cloud. And that it probably is not going to go away. The supply chain will potentially have problems keeping up, and then we'll maybe get to a situation of oversupply. But that demand is set to grow. So we've gone on this digital first path. Every business is on it. If a business is not on it, it's hard to see how they're going to compete. And by the way, I think Gartner are predicting that by 2025, 50% of data will be created and processed at the edge. This is growing. And I've seen even studies which say 90% by the year 2030, because the economics of moving it to the cloud or to a data center to process don't make sense, or indeed we don't have the bandwidth or the tolerance for latency. So I do think we're going to see more and more demand, but the cyclicality of it is very hard to predict.
Yes, absolutely. Jem?
This doesn't work. Okay. I want to, I agree with the cyclical nature of the semiconductor industry, but I think we have to keep in mind that it may be cyclical, but the trend is a cyclical but upwards trend. And the chip shortage actually started before COVID. COVID just exacerbated, maybe accelerated it. And yes, maybe there's a bit of a correction, but that correction is not due to less demand, but it's actually really geopolitical policies now influencing the demand. And this is going to come from a young person's perspective, but maybe we see COVID as a black swan event, but I see it as something that might happen more regularly. El Niños are supposed to be rare events, but we're seeing more of these El Niño events. And is our supply chain ready to tolerate these disruptions that might happen more often? Do we as a nation want to make that bet? That's kind of where I'll leave whether, the question of whether we're overcorrecting or not.
Niraj, anything to add?
Yeah, I agree with the perspectives presented here. One more thing to highlight is I think this crisis over the last couple of years has shone the light on a real interesting fact about our industry. 60% of all chips the world consumes are made on a tiny island of Taiwan in Asia, right? And advanced chips, it's up to 90% of the more advanced chips are actually built in Taiwan. That is a huge weakness and problem with the global supply chain. Should anything happen, that throws into jeopardy, the whole world economy. So it's things like that, I think, that have come to the forefront, and now countries are responding to that. I mean, we've seen this all in the news the last couple of years. Countries like Egypt and Saudi Arabia and Spain are announcing investments in semiconductors. Countries like Japan that exited the business over the last decade plus are now trying to re-enter with the help of TSMC and UMC. So there's definitely recognition of this issue and a real will to do something about it. And I think that's really healthy for us going forward, not only to support the growth of demand that Jem just spoke about, but also to make it a more robust supply chain for us for the future.
Absolutely. I mean, part of the challenge is where manufacturing is happening. And so I'm wondering, Phil, from an Intel perspective, can you speak to how we can rebalance production? So more, you spoke to this in your keynote a little bit, but so more is happening specifically in Canada.
Yeah, I mean, it comes from policy. It starts with government. I don't want to say too much because it's I'm an Intel spokesperson, but I should be really careful what I say. But the US CHIPS Act, which I'm sure many of you are aware of, was a huge catalyst in the investment in those new fabs in Ohio and also Arizona and Mexico, and also, by the way, building in Europe, obviously the local acts there. So if we want to stimulate chip or semiconductor silicon manufacturing processes in any given country in the world, do remember that the organizations who have the muscle and the ability to do that are also commercial entities. And it is important that they have government support to even start that conversation. And so if there was anyone from federal government here in a position of influence, I'd be kind of screaming at them or asking them very politely in a Canadian way to say, we need the same in Canada if we want to attract that type of investment here, because there are many countries, and Niraj was just referring to those whose governments are prepared to make those big bets and investments in the industry, and we need to do that in Canada too.
Jem, please. I mean, one of the questions on my list was just, we have government and industry players in the room, and as not a spokesperson for Intel, Jem, what do you think that public and private sector players can do to work towards solutions for supply chain challenges?
For sure. I told Phil I'll cover him, so I think this is the moment. I will say that government support doesn't necessarily mean it helps, but it doesn't necessarily mean matching funds. It just means that there is this willingness on multiple levels, from federal to provincial to municipal, to move to make this happen. So this may mean, for example, reducing the amount of time ready to get permits to build things, because you have to remember, when you're bringing these, $20 billion fabs, you have less than 4 years to gain your basically your investments back. In fact, I know that Intel can bring a $20 billion fab up and running in 18 months because they have a straight line 4-year capital depreciation. So can you imagine building something so massive without the support of the community? And so that's the Canadian government, and any government should really be thinking about what support other than just dollars that you can provide for these big companies and little guys to make this happen. So it's a multi-level problem, and there has to be the willingness and the willpower to do so. Yeah.
No, I'd just like to add one more thing to our friends in the government that are here today. I don't want to make it as daunting a problem as it sounds. Okay, so again, coming back to the idea that the semiconductor industry is not a monolith, you don't have to write a $20 billion check to build a advanced silicon processing fab. You can build a compound semiconductor fab, indium phosphide, silicon germanium. There's many technologies that actually we can play in that cost a lot less than that, right? There's many different areas that we can focus on as well. We don't have to produce wafers. We can focus on assembly and test, for example, and build that capability. So there's a lot of levers here. And I think it all starts with getting educated on what those levers are, how this industry really works. And I think partners, the government needs to build partners with industry through organizations like Venture Lab and through our academic institutions. I mean, this is the phenomenal asset we have here in Canada, is the quality of research and academic work happening here is top tier, top shelf. And if the government can find more effective ways to tap into those ideas and insights, then I think we can do this in a nice Canadian way, on the cheap, under the radar, but highly, highly effective.
Jem?
I think Niraj's approach is very smart, but I want to fight you a little bit on that. The
Panels are only fun when people disagree, right?
I think Canada needs to change its approach a little bit. Instead of thinking of a dollar amount first and then moving back, I think we should think of what value do we want to generate, and what money is required to generate that value, right? I mean, if we think that Canada can only be a $1 billion semiconductor industry, then we have to scale our R&D investments on every government level accordingly. But I think we should dream bigger than that, and not have a hard cap. We're not a sports franchise who, we're already playing an unfair game. And if we're going to handicap ourselves, I think Canada shouldn't handicap ourselves by saying, okay, we need to, only put this amount of money, and what's the bang for the buck for the money. I think we should work on, this is our ambition, this is the value we can generate, and what does it take to get there? Because the multipliers are there. So it goes back to, you have to have the willpower, and what is the value of Canadian willpower? So, yeah, not too combative, but it's just
I agree with everything you said.
I think it's just, we can be more than niche, is what I'm trying to say, right? We should grow the niche, but we can be more than niche.
No argument here for me. I just think we need to build the wins, right? Build a small win so that people see results in a timely fashion and support. It's easier to build more support. That's all. But I do agree with the idea of having the grand vision, right? That's really crucial.
Canada's very good at peacemaking.
Phil, where do you sit on this side of the debate?
I'm going to be Canadian. You're both right. There's another aspect to this to layer on top, though, which is that Canada has a perfect environment and climate and geography for these types of investments. It's no coincidence, for those of you who are not aware, during the kind of the Bitcoin mining gold rush, a lot of those data centers which were looking for cryptocurrency were located here in Canada, because there's natural cooling in the environment, there's hydro, there's water, there is space, there is talent, And the same should apply to this type of investment we're talking about. We have this vast country, and incidentally, it's why I moved here in 2011. We made a long-term strategic bet in our family that this was going to be a great country to live in for the next decades and a great place for our kids to come to. So I'd really want to layer that on. Canada has a lot of advantages, and we should not ignore those in the argument for kind of global leadership.
And you haven't looked back since.
We came for 2 years, and we never went back. Yeah.
There you go.
Thank you for having us.
One of the requirements in order to increase investment and output in the space is talent. And I think, we have a closing panel today all about talent. So I don't want to spend too much time on it, but Phil, obviously, at a company like Intel, talent is extremely important, and talent along the supply chain. So what trends are you seeing in hiring and recruiting, and how does that affect some of the disruptions that we've seen?
Incredible talent in this country, particularly in the higher education space. It really is strong. I almost don't want to list off some universities for fear of not getting some of them, but Waterloo, Toronto, UBC, McGill, etc. There is a lot of technical talent coming out in this country. The only caveat to that, and it's the reason, by the way, that we spend some time at Intel educating kids at the elementary level, is that our education system in K-12 has not yet caught up. So our STEM policies are really just not good enough to generate enough of a talent pool, I think, to feed those excellent universities and higher education institutions. So the kind of, again, if I could make a call to action, if you have kids, particularly if you have daughters, it's not put down the iPad or put down the tablet. It's spend more time on it, being creative, constructively creative, look at kind of basic programming skills, Scratch, depending on the age of the children we're talking about, to feed that engineering pool, because it's clear that our global job market is changing and shifting. We're all worried about how much employment is going to be in the future. Technology is not one of the areas where there is going to be decreased demand.
Yeah. Well, I was talking to a gentleman earlier who said he built an impressive treehouse in his backyard when he was younger, and instead of telling him to stop, his parents encouraged it, which led to a very long career in building things. So it is important to foster from a young age. And I have a 1-year-old daughter, so I am betting on her becoming a technologist, because that is part of my retirement plan, and we'll see how that goes. So, Niraj, anything to add on? Obviously you're a smaller company, and so talent is even more crucial because you have to make the right hires. What trends have you seen? What challenges have you seen in recruiting for your own companies?
Well, okay, I'll start. So, so finding the right talent is always a challenge, no matter where you are, right? So that's number one. Number two, I think for Canada, one other huge asset we have and ties into talent is our immigration policy and how open this country is to welcoming people from all over the world. And this is really helping us tremendously. I mean, I know plenty of people that lost their status in the US and moved over to Canada. So their loss is our gain. And I have, tons of students in universities pursuing their higher education, their master's degrees, their PhDs. We've hired a couple of them here at Blumind that have come to Canada because of our policies in welcoming people from all over the world. So that's a huge asset. And I think we should find ways to play that more than we already are, because I think there's a lot more we can do there. And that's a huge source of talent that we have that many other countries do not.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Zinite is dealing with what we're trying to solve is fundamentally a manufacturing problem. And that is, that skill set is a little bit bare bones in Canada. So our strategy, we can't necessarily just hire people who have those skill sets. We bring them into our startup and train them. And our strategy has been to do it as early as possible. In fact, I'm really glad Phil brought up the Pat Gelsinger story, because that's literally the story we use to inspire some of the even undergrads who haven't received their degrees yet, attract them to our company so that we can train them in our processes, the way that we want to build and commercialize our technology as early as possible. and if with the help of the feds, we can scale this kind of operation. I think that's really critical to optimizing and making talent acquisition in Canada better. So it's not even just about improving immigration policy, which I think is very important, or even just or more generally speaking, attracting talent, but it's having the resources to build our talent, because semiconductor industry, even after you get your PhD, you will be going through 1 or 2 years of more training within your company. And it's better to address that as early as possible, because, young people are more energetic. Just calling you guys out a little bit. Yeah.
In general, I don't know. My parents are still pretty energetic. My mom still works for a high-tech company at 67, so it's great to see. Jem, in our chat prior to today's panel, you talked about the importance of research and development and the role that that plays in developing our capabilities here in Canada. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that for a moment.
Okay, cool. My last statement kind of transitions into this. I think a great, in our previous discussion, kind of leading up to this panel, I think we all kind of came to the realization that 20 years ago or so, Canada made a bet that semiconductors would be commodified, and that we're okay with these manufacturing being offshore. But that gamble, I don't think, has paid off, and we've had this situation where Canada is now very vulnerable to not having access to high-tech technology that is enabled by semiconductors. And so, in a way, we have to rebuild that talent, right? We have to rebuild that workforce. And one of my proposals to having Canada be a contributor, $100 billion value contributor to the semiconductor industry, started with an R&D type of facility, because the semiconductor industry is at an inflection point. They don't just need innovation at the chip level, they need it in the materials level, right? Silicon is having some fundamental limits, and there's much more creativity you can do with silicon, but it's now no longer the only solution. We need multiple solutions on multiple fronts. And the Canadian government has made bets on the academic and research level, but there is a big void from everything from, after the academics to what you can get into factories today. So this is why I really like to push. I am biased because we're a materials and process company for an R&D like facility, following similar models like SETI or IMEC, who are very successful, who generate value, create value within their own countries. And I think Canada should do the same, because it's the logical next step based on the investments that we've made so far.
Yeah. Niraj, anything to add there?
Yeah, I actually think Canada, comparatively to other countries in the world, does a pretty good job with R&D. We have great universities, we have great government programs like SHRED and IRAP and NSERC. These are great assets. And I mean, I talk to investors in the US, for example, and they look at these programs and they go, really? Wow, you get all this support? So a lot of VCs outside of Canada are tuned into this. We do R&D pretty well. Not to say there's not room for improvement.
Yeah.
Dollars.
Yes.
It's absolutely there, right? I think actually where we're really struggling is on the capital front and on the ecosystem front, right? So there's a lot of money in Canada, but very little of it makes its way to deep tech projects, right? Because there's a lack of understanding and a lack of risk taking, if you will. There's a number of reasons for this, but there's very little of it that makes its way into this deep tech world. So we should, there, I think we need to find creative ways to improve that flow. And then the ecosystem angle as well. It's as we've been talking, right? It takes many elements to build a successful semiconductor company and industry. And having players like Venture Lab and incubators, trade bodies, et cetera, that help provide a platform for the industry and drive it further. That's very important as well. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we only have a few minutes left. I want to open it up to questions to see if anyone has anything that they want to ask our esteemed panelists. I see a question here. I'll repeat it to make sure that everyone watching virtually can hear. But sir, please let us know what your question is. Microphone's coming to you, sir. Thank you so much.
We're in a really interesting age. I saw a Chrysler K car yesterday. People remember what that is. It reminded me that we're kind of in the 1970s oil shock again, but for semiconductors, where we're highly dependent on a concentration of a very valuable resource in a single geopolitical location. And it's fundamental, as you said, that we shift our dependency off that one island elsewhere. I think my question is, what do you see as the rate of change? You said fabs are coming online. What do you see as the rate of change, as how fast will we transition off of that 60, 90% into other geographies?
Yeah, that's a really important question. I think Jem was alluding to this about the rate of speed with which you can get a fab up to production. So Intel is making these investments now. So we broke ground in September on the 2 fabs in Ohio, but they're not coming online until 2025. And then obviously being, having an internal foundry services model and an external foundry services model, it's dependent on, how many orders then come in before you can start shifting that. But say, even if you make decisions now, and let's say those decisions were made, I don't know, Steve's here, probably kind of 10 months ago, I would say that the Ohio thing was announced. Yeah, so you're looking at a 3, 4, maybe even 5-year window between making decisions and starting to affect that change. Hopefully what we see is a groundswell movement, but yeah, we need to kind of get cracking on this really to make the change that we're all asking. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you for that. Do we have any other questions? I see a hand up over here. Thank you to our microphone runner for making sure that our virtual attendees can hear the question.
Hi, everyone. Thank you very much. I think it was a great panel. Thank you, guys. And again, I have a question to Phil. And my question will be about how Intel want to address their idea of bringing contract manufacturing foundry and attracting other clients from the old nodes to the new nodes, keeping performance better and reducing price, because the fabs that you're building will be built on advanced nodes. It's not like paid 20 years ago, 300 nanometer, 200 nanometer fabs. That's a new investment.
Yeah, well, we're making a bet. We are very forthright about what we think will happen. But the way that we're doing this to make it more attractive, because actually you may or may not know that Intel tried this a few years ago and it kind of failed. And it failed because what we said to the external customers was, well, listen, if we've got some capacity going in our fabs, yeah, you can use it, but you're not seeing any of our IP. And by the way, if we suddenly see demand, then you're out. So it doesn't really take a lot to say that wasn't particularly attractive to the outside world. The way that we're doing it, approaching it this time, is making sure that there are capacity corridors which are free for those external fabless companies who want to manufacture. And that is our bet. So we are very confident that this is the right strategy to be on for the company, moving away from IDM 1.0. And I hope and believe that that's correct, but time will tell. But that's what we think is going to happen. I'd love to get a view from some of the guys who are next to me from the other side of the equation.
Well, I'll just say I really hope it happens as well, Phil, because I think there's a lot riding on Intel, not just
no pressure, Phil.
Not just as a company, but as a we all need Intel to be a very strong player in this world. And they, as Phil alluded to, they kind of lost their way for a bunch of years, but now really making a strong push. So I really hope you guys emerge as a strong contender here.
I will say that I am also a believer of IDM 2.0. I think it's the right strategic move. I think just as we are asking for a call to action for the community here in Canada, I think if Intel's open-mindedness continues to improve and learn from why foundries like TSMC were successful. Simplifying, for example, your manuals for PDKs and stuff like that. I think it will be extremely successful. I mean, really listening to chip designers and why they like custom foundries. I think that would really kind of make IDM 2.0 success inevitable.
Wonderful. We have time for one more question. I have a hand up down here.
Thank you. My question is for Niraj. So Niraj, when the supply chain issues were happening, you think it was more profound on startups? And do you believe that extra support needs to be given to startups because their holding power might not be there to, I mean, if you have these kind of issues?
Yeah. By the way,
Thank you.
Ekalavya is one of the guys I met face to face today for the first time. So that was great. So it's a great question. And being a fabless semiconductor design startup, yes, there has been an impact, right? So primarily for startups that are in the early stages like us building prototypes, we get pushed to the back of the bus, right? In terms of incentives, typically these big foundries have incentives for startups. They give you heavy discounts. They help you along. Those incentives disappeared. So we had to write a retail price check for our prototype. And for startups in volume production, again, they have much more challenge negotiating volumes and time in the fab, because again, the fabs, understandably, if they're overbooked, if they're running at 95% capacity or more, they're going to service their more valuable clients, right? So the small guy gets, again, pushed to the back. So yes, absolutely, it's a big challenge. And I know of companies that have been hurt by this. But as I mentioned earlier, I see the situation improving rapidly. I mean, just recently in the news, there have been reports about TSMC saying their order book is declining, right, going forward, which is, again, it's a natural correction from where we were for the last couple of years. So I think the next couple of years will be a bit more relaxed and open, so things will get better.
Wonderful. Well, we are at time. I appreciate all of the questions from the audience. No one wants to be the first one to put their hand up, so I appreciate it. And I want to say thank you so much to Phil for your keynote and your insights today, to Jem for sharing your insights and for flying across the country to be with us today, and to Niraj for joining us as well. Please join me in giving a round of applause to our panelists.